The neighborhood of Sunridge Pines liked to advertise itself as quiet, refined, and tastefully uniform. A phrase repeated so often in HOA newsletters that residents joked it must have been tattooed on the board president's eyelids. It was the kind of community where houses were different only in the ways that a ruler might notice. One porch beam slightly thicker, one mailbox post a shade darker, one lawn trimmed a millimeter shorter. Everything else hovered in a neutral sameness that the HOA fiercely guarded. Grass could be green, beige, or dormant. Flowers could be seasonal, subdued, or removed. Decorations were allowed only if approved, and only during certain weeks, and only if they did not constitute visual disruption. When Mason Alder bought the corner lot home with the deep front yard and massive oak tree, he admired the tranquility, but he also sensed the faint tension in the air, like everyone was quietly competing to win an award for Most Invisible Resident. Mason was not a loud man, nor was he reckless, but he enjoyed small quirks: a charming mailbox decal, a whimsical wind chime, a brightly painted birdhouse. And sometimes, if the mood was right, he enjoyed the company of novelty lawn ornaments. The first gnome arrived on a Saturday morning, delivered in an oversized box wrapped in red tape. It had a chipped hat, a half smile, and a mischievous tilt to its eyebrows. Mason placed it near the base of the oak tree, more as a private joke than a decoration he expected anyone to notice. It was hardly conspicuous. In fact, someone walking by would have had to squint to see it. But Sunridge Pines was the kind of place where people squinted by default, scanning for anything that might threaten the sterile aesthetic they held so dear. For 2 days, the gnome sat quietly, guarding the roots of the oak in his tiny concrete shoes. And in those 2 days, Mason noticed the faint shuffle of neighbors slowing their walks whenever they passed his home. A couple of them tilted their heads. One of them, an elderly woman with a visor and an ironed running jacket, actually walked backward to confirm what she saw. No one said anything, at least not to Mason. But on the morning of the 3rd day, a crisp letter in an official HOA envelope appeared in his mailbox. It was a violation notice. The message was as stiff and emotionless as all HOA notices were: unapproved yard ornamentation, unsanctioned decorative figure, non-compliant aesthetic addition. The letter demanded immediate removal of the offending item and warned of daily fines if he failed to comply. It cited 3 sections of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, sections so vague they could apply to almost anything, including, Mason suspected, the existence of grass itself. He read the letter twice. Then he glanced at the tiny gnome still sitting beneath the oak tree, its smile unchanged. Something inside Mason shifted. The notice wasn't a surprise. He had suspected the gnome might stir the pot, but the intensity of the reaction, the immediate leap to fines, threats, and sternly worded orders, sparked a slow burn in him. Still, he tried to handle the matter calmly. He reread the HOA rulebook, searching for the relevant sections. He paid close attention to the language used. The rules were maddeningly broad, but there was one line, one small, almost hidden clause, that stuck out to him. Yard decorations were allowed so long as they were temporary, movable, and not excessive in number. The letter claimed his gnome was non-compliant, but the rulebook suggested otherwise. The contradiction intrigued him. The following week, Mason attempted a polite appeal. He emailed the HOA board, referencing the rulebook and attaching a photo of the gnome. The board replied with a short message reaffirming their stance. They insisted the gnome did not align with the community's aesthetic expectations and must be removed. No further explanations. No wiggle room. He asked for a meeting. They refused and sent a second violation notice with a sterner tone. He realized then that the argument wasn't about rules at all. It was about control. A single gnome, small and harmless, had pierced the perfectly manicured bubble of Sunridge Pines. And the HOA couldn't tolerate that. Not because it truly impacted property values, but because they feared what would happen if someone got away with it. If one person placed a whimsical ornament, perhaps another would place 2. And if someone placed 2, perhaps someone else would place 3. And then, by the HOA's logic, chaos. So Mason made a decision. He removed the gnome, but only temporarily. He placed it on his porch while he worked on something else, something more thorough. He spent days combing through the HOA guidelines, reading every clause, footnote, and obscure reference. He highlighted passages. He researched local property laws. He compared Sunridge Pines regulations to neighboring counties. He watched hours of online HOA horror stories, studying the patterns of petty power and the loopholes that exposed them. By the end of the week, he had a plan. The HOA rulebook, he discovered, did not explicitly limit the size of yard decorations, nor did it restrict the number allowed so long as they remained non-excessive and not visually obtrusive. The board's interpretations were subjective, but the written rules were what mattered legally. And buried deep in an appendix, he found a clause allowing small, movable statuary. So long as it did not block pathways or create hazards, a gnome was small. A gnome was movable. A gnome was statuary. One gnome annoyed them. He wondered how they would feel about more on Friday evening. After dusk, Mason placed the original gnome back beneath the oak. By Saturday morning, 3 more had appeared beside it. They were strategically spaced, facing different directions, forming a small semicircle. They were barely noticeable from the street unless one looked closely. They were unquestionably compliant. Residents began to slow their walks again, except now their glances carried more urgency. The visor lady stopped entirely and stared for a full 10 seconds. 2 teenage boys took photos. Someone across the street watched from their window, phone pressed to their ear, likely alerting the HOA president of this new development. By Sunday afternoon, as if on schedule, a board member dropped off another violation notice. Not mailed, but hand-delivered. The tone was harsher, the language almost frantic. The HOA accused Mason of intentionally provoking the community with a growing display of decorative objects. They called it a breach of community standards. They threatened escalating fines, legal review, and further action. But this time, Mason didn't feel annoyed, he felt energized. The gnomes stayed where they were, and that night, under the cover of darkness, he added 2 more. One peeking from behind a shrub, another sitting cheerfully at the base of the mailbox. All were legally compliant. All were harmless. All were deeply, gloriously irritating to the HOA board. By the end of the week, the neighborhood was buzzing. People whispered during morning walks. Cars slowed in front of the yard. The next HOA newsletter mentioned unapproved decorations 3 separate times without naming names, an omission that only made the rumors grow louder. Mason watched it all unfold quietly, feeling the spark of an idea grow into something bigger, something he could almost visualize taking shape across his lawn. The Gnome Army had only just begun. The next week unfolded like a slow-motion chain reaction. Each neighborly glance, muffled whisper, and hurried phone call building toward something the HOA had never anticipated. Sunridge Pines had weathered arguments over mailbox paint, disputes about Christmas lights, and even a full-blown turf war over a rose bush that dared to grow 1 inch beyond regulation height. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had spread through the community with the same speed and fascination as Mason's growing collection of gnomes. By Monday morning, there were 9. Each one appeared strategically placed, as though conducting silent reconnaissance across the lawn. One stood beneath the oak tree holding a tiny fishing pole. Another leaned cheerfully against the mailbox. 2 peeked from behind the neatly trimmed shrubs, half hidden and half watching. None were obstructive. None were oversized. All, by the language of the rules, were legal, and all of them were causing havoc. The HOA board members, normally content to operate behind emails and printed letters, were suddenly spotted walking the neighborhood in groups of 2 or 3, clipboards clutched tightly, eyes narrowed with suspicion. They held impromptu meetings on sidewalks. They paced in front of Mason's home, gesturing dramatically each time a new gnome appeared. They even discussed the matter in the community Facebook group, where residents pretended not to be entertained but secretly relished every moment of the unfolding drama. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the gnomes were meant to drive property values down. Others said Mason was planning a protest against the HOA after being wronged in ways nobody could quite explain. A few insisted the gnomes were cursed, tongue-in-cheek but repeated often enough that the tale gained its own momentum. Meanwhile, Mason watched quietly from his living room window, sipping his morning coffee. He hadn't anticipated how quickly the situation would escalate, but he wasn't surprised. The HOA operated like a pressure cooker. Small things built into large conflicts because no one was allowed to simply ignore something that, violated the aesthetic harmony. The board was used to compliance. They were used to meek apologies, swift corrections, and the type of resignation that made people plant beige flowers because colorful ones might attract attention. The gnomes were not beige. They were cheerful, colorful, whimsical, and, in their own silent way, rebellious. When the next violation notice arrived, it was nearly twice as long as the previous ones. The letter referenced the decorations as a growing disturbance, a potential safety hazard, and a direct challenge to the expectations of the community. It threatened maximum fines, suspension of homeowner privileges, and even legal action. The final paragraph said the issue would be added to the agenda for the upcoming HOA board meeting. Mason smiled at that. A meeting meant witnesses, neighbors, an audience. He reread the rules again, searching for any changes, any amendments that might hinder his plan. There were none. If the board wanted to modify the regulations, they would need a vote from the community, something Mason suspected would be much harder to secure now that the neighborhood was thoroughly captivated by the spectacle. By Thursday, the gnome count reached 14. The HOA president, a man known for wearing pressed khakis even on weekends, visited personally. He paced in front of the lawn for several minutes, staring at the gnomes like they were an invading force. He scribbled something furiously onto his clipboard, snapped several photos, then left with an expression that sat somewhere between outrage and panic. Neighbors took notice. By Friday afternoon, the first smartphone video appeared in the community group, a shaky recording of the HOA president photographing a gnome while muttering to himself. The video spread quickly, garnering reactions from amusement to disbelief. Conversations blossomed at mailboxes, driveways, and neighborhood corners. Some residents defended the HOA, others mocked them. A few quietly admitted they wished they'd thought of doing something similar. The HOA meeting that weekend was packed. Mason attended not out of obligation but out of curiosity. He arrived early and took a seat near the back of the clubhouse. The room buzzed with anticipation. Board members shuffled papers and whispered nervously. Residents filled every chair, some standing near the walls, all pretending not to be here for the gnomes, even though everyone was here for the gnomes. The board president cleared his throat and launched into the meeting with the stiffness of a man trying to maintain dignity while discussing something inherently ridiculous. He described the gnomes as a disruptive escalation and a threat to community standards. He cited property values, aesthetic cohesion, and homeowner responsibility. His voice tightened whenever he said the word gnomes. As though it pained him physically, he proposed a new rule: a ban on all lawn statues not explicitly approved by the HOA, and murmurs rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement, but others exchanged uneasy glances. One woman whispered that her family had a decorative stone turtle in their garden. Would that be banned? Another wondered about seasonal ornaments. Someone mentioned their holiday snowman statues. Suddenly, people realized the proposal wouldn't just target Mason, it would target everyone. Support for the new rule faltered visibly. Mason didn't speak. He didn't need to. The atmosphere shifted without him ever rising from his seat. When the board attempted to push the proposal to an immediate vote, several residents protested. They demanded time to consider the implications. They questioned the urgency. They criticized the board for overstepping. What had started as an attempt to control one man's gnomes had spiraled into a full-blown opposition movement. The board postponed the vote. The meeting adjourned in frustration, and Mason walked home knowing exactly what he would do next. That night, long after the clubhouse lights dimmed and residents retreated into their tidy homes, he went into his garage. The shelves were lined with boxes he'd ordered over the past week, each marked with labels like fragile, garden figure, and novelty decor. He opened them one by one, carefully removing the contents. Dozens of gnomes, each with different poses, expressions, and themes, stared back at him. It was time to deploy the next phase. Under the soft glow of the streetlights, he arranged 15 more across the yard. Some stood boldly in plain view. Others peeked from flower beds, perched near the walkway, or leaned nonchalantly beside potted plants. Each one was placed with intention, aligned perfectly with the rules and impossible to dispute individually. By morning, the count had doubled. The neighborhood awoke to the largest display of garden gnome Sunridge pines had ever seen. maybe the largest anyone had ever seen in a suburban neighborhood at all. The HOA was furious. The residents were thrilled. The drama had only just begun. By the time the sun rose on Sunday morning, the gnome population on Mason's lawn had reached full numerical dominance. They stood in rows, clusters, formations, and pockets of cheerful defiance. Some held miniature lanterns. Others rested on toadstools. A few were dressed as firemen, fishermen, knights, bakers, or wandering adventurers. The variety alone made the display impossible to ignore, and by mid-morning, half the neighborhood had gravitated toward the sidewalk, lingering just long enough to take in the spectacle that it was no longer simply a quirky decoration or even a pointed jab at the HOA. It had become a tourist attraction within Sunridge Pines, a landmark of chaos in a community accustomed to sterile predictability. Cars slowed to a crawl. Residents brought their morning coffee to view the ongoing escalation. Children delighted in discovering new gnomes hidden in the landscaping. And with every visitor, curiosity turned to quiet amusement. But the HOA did not find the situation amusing at all. By noon, 3 board members gathered at the edge of the lawn, frowning deeply at the growing crowd. They carried clipboards, cameras, notebooks, and an air of frantic authority. Their determination to regain control only made the scene more surreal. 3 adults scrutinizing dozens of tiny ceramic figures as if each one were a serious threat to suburban civilization. They inspected every gnome individually. They took meticulous photographs, muttered to each other, flipped through the HOA rulebook, and attempted to find justification for a mass violation. Yet each figurine met the criteria: small, movable, non-hazardous, and not blocking any pathways. They were numerous, but the rulebook had never defined the term excessive. And without that crucial specification, they had no clear grounds for enforcement. The board members' frustration grew. Their pacing became more animated, their gestures more exaggerated. Onlookers watched the entire display with an unspoken mixture of fascination and barely concealed amusement. Later that afternoon, a new announcement appeared in everyone's email inbox. A notice calling for an emergency HOA board meeting to address the ongoing situation. The tone was sharp, urgent, and unmistakably desperate. Residents were encouraged to attend, though the board noted that only members could vote on official matters. The message concluded with a reminder that the integrity of Sunridge Pines is at stake. Within hours, the neighborhood buzzed louder than ever. Mason didn't respond publicly. He didn't post in the community group. He didn't confront the board members standing outside his home. He simply went about his day. But as he walked past the Gnome Army, he could feel the energy of the neighborhood shifting. His quiet resistance had done something the HOA had never intended. Given the community a shared spectacle, a reason to gather, laugh, and talk openly. When the emergency meeting began that evening, the clubhouse filled even faster than before. People streamed in, fueled by a mix of annoyance, curiosity, and a determination to witness whatever chaos was about to unfold. A few residents couldn't find seats and ended up standing near the back, whispering among themselves. The board president, stern and visibly frazzled, called the meeting to order. He opened with a statement about the gnome crisis, framing it as an urgent threat to community cohesion. He described the decorations as a slippery slope toward neighborhood disorder, insisting that such displays needed to be controlled before Sunridge Pines lost its identity. Yet as he spoke, something had shifted. The residents no longer sat quietly, nodding along. Instead, they watched him with the weary skepticism of people who had reached an unspoken conclusion. The board was overreacting. One resident raised a hand, asking whether decorative animals would be banned as well. Another wanted to know about seasonal holiday figures. A third questioned why the board felt such urgency when the decorations harmed no one and attracted no complaints from property appraisers. Each question made the board's argument appear weaker, more performative, and disconnected from the community's actual concerns. The board tried to respond, but their answers circled back to vague claims about protecting aesthetics and preventing visual clutter. Their inability to articulate a concrete, practical reason only deepened the skepticism in the room. Then came the turning point that a retired man who had lived in Sunridge Pines since its founding stood up and calmly explained that decorative items had always been part of the community's landscape. He reminded the board that several members had, at various times, placed unapproved decorations themselves: holiday reindeer, patriotic flags, ceramic turtles, and even a faux rustic wagon wheel that had sat in one resident's yard for nearly a decade. The board had never enforced rules against those items. Selective enforcement, he said, was the real issue. His words landed hard. The room went quiet, and the board members stiffened, glancing anxiously at one another. They began to lose their footing. Residents murmured their agreement. Even those who disliked the gnomes nodded along, recognizing the truth in the man's words. When the board attempted to push a vote banning all lawn statues not individually approved, several residents objected loudly. They argued that the proposal was far too broad and would give the board excessive discretionary power, something no one wanted after witnessing how aggressively they had pursued one man's harmless gnomes. Momentum shifted completely. The board had no choice but to withdraw the motion. A sense of victory rippled through the crowd. Not a loud or chaotic victory, but a quiet reclaiming of autonomy. Residents left the clubhouse with a new sense of unity, chatting excitedly as they walked back to their homes. Mason returned home as the sun began to set, feeling a deep calm settle over him. He hadn't intended to spark a neighborhood movement, but the Gnome Army had done exactly that. It had shown the residents that the HOA's authority wasn't absolute, and that collectively, they could push back against needless control as darkness fell. The gnomes seemed to glow under the soft wash of the streetlights, their painted smiles shining like tiny symbols of resistance. The lawn looked like a miniature village, peaceful, cheerful, and strangely powerful. The next morning, the HOA sent a terse email acknowledging that no action would be taken against Mason's lawn decorations. They stated that any future rule changes would require community review and majority approval. It was the closest the board had come to admitting defeat. By the afternoon, neighbors began stopping by Mason's home, not to complain but to admire. A few brought coffee, others brought cameras. One family even arrived carrying a gnome of their own, asking if they could contribute to the display. Mason accepted it with a grin. Though the Gnome Army had started as a protest, it had become something else entirely. A symbol of freedom in a place where conformity had ruled for far too long. Over the next week, gnomes began appearing in other yards. Small ones, subtle ones, quirky ones. Not in defiance, but in quiet solidarity. The HOA didn't comment. They didn't issue notices. They didn't protest. They had learned their lesson. And so, in a neighborhood once defined by rigid uniformity, a new chapter began. One where individuality, humor, and harmless expression found a place to thrive. All thanks to a single, smiling gnome at the base of an old oak tree.